morning, everybody, and the millions of people live streaming this, that we're sure are awake in their rooms on this Friday morning. I am really excited about this panel today. We have an amazing set of experts here that represent many different parts of the space and geospatial community. And so we're going to kick off with a really big question, which is, what do you think are the current, so right now based on current technology, currently policy, the largest opportunities for the geospatial and GEOINT community to impact climate change policy? And I'd love to start with you, Barb.
Yes, thanks very much, Rachel. Let's see, I guess a couple things. If I think about what the skills are and abilities of this community, it's to look at things in a systematic or from a systems approach in an integrated fashion. And for me, that's one of the greatest strengths that's there. If I put my hat on, which has largely been on the civilian side for so long, we are so segmented. Our organizations are segmented. We break down the earth with agencies that just worry about the atmosphere or just the oceans or just the lands. And if we're gonna tackle an issue like climate change, we've just got to do a better job of looking at the entire earth as an integrated system. So in my mind, this community has got some skills on the integration side and just looking at things in a much more coordinated fashion.
That's awesome. Robbie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, our community is not just for intelligence. When you're talking about Earth systems, a lot of that is really driven by the science community and understanding our changing planet. Since we launched our first satellite as humanity into space, we've almost doubled the population on our planet. Earth systems scientists understand more of the interlocking relationship between our ecosystems, between our watersheds, and between our food systems. Now what's unique is things are accelerating so much. That's where GEOINT and this community can really help, which is to look through and understand what are the true signals that are the leading indicators to then help people make data-driven decisions. That's what this tradecraft is really about. And it's not just to make those decisions, but it's to forecast out potential futures so that you can anticipate what's about to happen and become more resilient. So it is, when we think about climate change, we should really be thinking, I love that you mentioned the Earth as a system. Think about land, sea, and city all together. And that's really a bit of the challenge of the existential challenge of our modern humanity of the time, is to get that to be more regenerative. Because the current approaches toward how we feed ourselves and the energy that we create and the waste that we create is not in symbiosis. And the effect of that right now is really, it's not necessarily climate. Climate is an effect. But it really is biodiversity in life. And these are the things that build tremendous value for us as humans, and they don't currently have a voice. Since I've been born, about 50% of the species on the planet have gone extinct. Climate change is real, but what's happening at a faster and faster rate is really biodiversity loss. So again, I think this community is based in science, but then has the tradecraft to find the signal to help people make better decisions. And there are a number of things along the way, I think, that we'll get to in our discussion that will be that can actually assist us to highlight the true risks that we face, then begin to forecast out the effects, the second and the third order effect that these will have on society. But Anthony, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks Rachel. Thanks USGIF for getting the band back together. It's really great to be back at a GEOINT. Look, the climate crisis is, I think, one of the most significant threats we face, period. And I feel like the GEOINT community leaves some resources on the table, some capabilities on the table that we're not fully utilizing to address it. And two come to mind in particular. One is data. Some people in the audience might know that there used to be a program to provide classified data to scientists, which could be used for addressing climate change. There's still a lot of that classified data out there that we could be using and we're not. And I think we need to bring that back onto the table and start to use it. The other real resource in the GEOINT community is people and talent. And we don't treat the climate crisis threat in the same way we treat other national security threats. We tend to focus on strategic competitors like China and so forth, which obviously we should, but the climate crisis can be just as dangerous to the nation as those kinds of threats. And an example of climate crisis type threats would be a pandemic, and I think we all know how bad that got and how many people died. More people died during COVID-19 than any American war, period. And when you look at the climate crisis, it could be that kind of threat, so we should treat it as a national security threat, and that means we should take our people in the GEOINT community, and I'm thinking about analysts and so forth in the intelligence community, and allow them to address this challenge. And to some degree, they already do in some niche missions, but it's not at the scale of the threat. We tend to treat it as a small kind of niche mission or something that's tangential to another issue. So if you think about desertification and how it affects a war in Darfur or Syria, for example, yes, some analysts address that issue, but we need to treat the climate crisis as a threat and bring all of that talent out there, because I know from experience, when I look at the analysts and other professionals in NGA and other organizations, that when they put their mind to it and when they have a mission requirement to focus on something, they're going to address that challenge in a real way, bring a lot of resources, bring a lot of intelligence, bring a lot of resources to that issue, and I think they're really going to help. And so hopefully we can kind of move to treating it as a national security threat, and now the whole entire GEOINT community, including those in the intelligence community itself, can address it.
I definitely want to have us circle back to, the security threats of climate change, but I want to drill down first in something that actually each of you brought up as you were talking, which is the data that will help inform people to make better data-driven decisions. And I think that because the space community has changed so rapidly over time, it's not just government-owned data, but we have companies like Planet, right, that are producing massive amounts of information that can help inform us. And on the government side, there's, like you're talking about, even classified data that needs to be shared with folks who can use it. And then on the commercial side, we need to make sure we're incentivizing, our companies that are producing data that can help inform people. What are your guys' thoughts on the mechanisms and ways that we can ensure the best data and analytics that people are working on already are making it to decision makers that need it? And Robbie, let's start with you, and then we'll go to you, Barb, and Anthony after that.
Yeah, so there were two questions that I heard in there. One is around data, making it accessible, and the second is around, or the way that I'm interpreting it, is around the tools to help people make better decisions. And if we break that out, really we can start to look at this as more of an ecosystem. And on the data side, a good thing about data is that it's like software. You produce it once, then you can license it many times. And also under a license, you can make the usage of it to be more specific, so that it's then cheaper or more accessible to a certain audience that you're trying to do. So a good example of that data license is something that I think, Barb, you know about a year ago. The Norwegian government, we entered into an interesting partnership where we opened up monthly cloud-free mosaics of 64 tropical forested countries, cloud-free monthly mosaics, to get everybody on the same map.
Yeah.
The same common operating picture about facts around what's happening with respect to deforestation. And now that in and of itself doesn't do anything unless there are the tools and the incentives for action. And so if we keep going with this example on the tools side of things, we've made it accessible via Esri, via Earth Engine, via the Food and Agriculture Organization at the UN in Rome. They have their own thing called CEPL. And so then the UN, they do capacity building for these 64 countries in order to then look at this measuring, reporting, and verification system. And then the last one is incentives. There's a program in the UN that is about reducing the emissions of the degradation and deforestation. And it's known as performance-based payments. So if, broadly speaking, if you don't cut down trees, you can have some resources, and they can take those resources to then create different economies, because they're cutting down those trees and they're planting soy and palm and et cetera. And so those three things together is like a little kernel and an ingredient of something that gets at a wicked problem. When you're short-term focused, when you don't have a lot of options, that's actually what you do for the livelihood of your communities. And this is where technology can just play one particular role. But it really is about interesting partnerships with aligned incentives that I think is something to replicate.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that, Robbie, because I think that's a really good example. So if you look at that Norwegian example, in my mind, it's just a great public-private partnership. And we need more of those, because the private sector is going to have different business models than the public sector. But let me just say, and this maybe goes back to Anthony's point earlier, is that we've still got government agencies on the civilian side that don't share data about the Earth. And it's not just, Earth observation data. It could be stream flow data, soil moisture data. And so what I have long argued in the organizations that I've been in is that if you are a civilian public agency, that your entire mandate was built off taxpayers' money, then all those taxpayers should have access to that information. Analysis we did on the Landsat data, which, the first satellite went up in 1972. For the data policy didn't change until 2007 or 2008. So whatever that is, 34 years. My organization at the time, the Geological Survey, was selling 53 scenes a day. We were asking the wrong question for those 30 years. How could you justify that kind of investment in a satellite on selling 53 images a day? As soon as the data policy changed, it goes up two orders of magnitude, 5,700 scenes a day. And even the more important part is an economic analysis was done a few years after I left the organization. $1.7 billion back to the US economy because of that data policy change, $400 million externally for a global total of $2.1 billion. That far exceeds the $5 million we, the Geological Survey, was collecting to sell those 53 scenes a day. So it makes economic sense for all public agencies, certainly on the civilian side, to make your data broadly and openly available. And you need it if you're going to look at the Earth in an integrated system. And then, of course, back to your point, Anthony, when I left the survey, the Civilian Applications Committee, which was the mechanism for the civilian agencies to get access to Intel data, was still there. So I'm kind of worried about your comment, like maybe it's not anymore, but I'll stop. Thanks.
Well, look, I completely agree with both what Barb and Robbie said. And I would add, in terms of accessibility, data literacy is a really important part of that. And decision makers and policy makers also need that data literacy in order to understand how to engage with data. And I know NGA and lots of other organizations in the community are already working on recruiting and training people in the analyst cadres and so forth to have that data literacy and to engage with data. But the decision makers need to also know how to engage with it. And a snapshot kind of typical all-source intelligence report, for example, it does not communicate data in a great way. And that's a long-term thing, and actually I do think it's partially on the analysts to help those policy makers and decision makers understand the data, be able to explain it to them. That's part of their job. It's not just to say what the intelligence it is, it's to communicate it and make sure that they understand it. The other piece, and in terms of the second part of your question on tools, related to that is I think models and simulation need to become a significant part of geospatial intelligence. They already are to some extent, but in particular when you talk about the climate crisis, you need to have models and simulations. That is how the issue is understood, analyzed, processed. But the way that the intelligence community is structured, that is not how intelligence products are typically created and ultimately communicated. And we need to start making that shift to be using these models and simulations, becoming comfortable with them, and then having them as part of the intelligence briefing process so that, for example, you're not just showing an all-source report in a briefing, but you're also showing a model and a simulation that that policymaker can engage upon and say, well, show me this scenario, show me that scenario, let's do this in real time and communicate it in real time so I can really understand what the ramifications are and understand the subtlety that comes in looking at large amounts of data.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Thank you guys for that. That's really wonderful. Earlier we were talking a bit about the intersection of climate change and national security. And of course, at GEOINT, one of the large, groups that's always here is the national security industry. So even though I think GEOINT is becoming more and more commercial and it intersects with more industries, I do want to dive into a little bit about, what is the added value that you guys have seen and that you guys hope the DoD and IC will bring to helping inform people of climate change in ways that academia and commercial industry still can't. And we can start with you, Anthony.
Yeah. It's a good question. A lot of the debate in terms of the DoD and militaries in general interaction with climate change has been upon clean energy and things like that. Our military is the largest in the world, and it's probably therefore one of the most, polluting singular organizations that there are in the world. And that is a legitimate debate to have. And I think we're already seeing actually that organization becoming, I would consider a first mover in terms of wholesale movement to something more clean. But I would put that to the side and go back to where I kind of started and say the real way that the Defense Department, the intelligence community, the national security community in general can support the climate crisis and the communication of it is to reframe the discussion to think about the climate crisis as a threat to people, to our nation, as a national security threat in the literal sense, in the way that we consider the proliferation of nuclear weapons or terrorist organizations a threat, because people can and do die from it, because wars are started from it, because there are contributing national security issues that arise from it. Even little things like, for example, if you think about the melting of the polar ice caps, and the change in salinity in water in some of those areas and the effect that has on things like submarines, for example, or the opening of the Northwest Passage and what that does to geopolitics and opens up an entire new contested area of the world. These are all true national security issues in a very real sense. And I think that if the military and the national security community more broadly would treat it that way, you'd be able to cross this barrier that is political and cultural right now within our nation in particular on what the climate crisis really is. And I think you would be able to get over some of those political barriers, and that people would begin to realize, no, this is a literal life and death matter. It's a national security matter. If you want to support our military, which I think most people do, then you need to understand that's part of their mission, and what they're doing is protecting you, and they should take part in this.
I think this community has also led the way with the incorporation of private sector assets into the whole study. You know, if we go back to the original NextView and Clearview contracts, you know, with Digital Globe and GEOI and now Maxar, that set the stage for the development of a commercial market here in the United States anyway. The organization that I'm with now, the World Geospatial Industry Council, best of my knowledge, is the first global trade association, but we just recently undertook a study of greenhouse gases from space. So we did it on behalf of the private sector, who's measuring just those 4 greenhouse gases that the convention recognizes. Former organization GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, did it from the public sector. And what we saw from that study, it's about to be released at the Conference of the Parties in a couple weeks in Glasgow, is that there are just workhorses out there on the public sector side, and yet certainly for greenhouse gases in the 90s and the 2000s, in the 2010s, we're starting to see the private sector come in. There's only one company now that has that capability in space, GHGSat, but there are 7 or 8 in the pipeline to start looking at those gases. So private sector engagement in the 2010s, and this I think is maybe goes back to the Norway example. What we're seeing in the 2020s are hybrid models, so the public sector and the private sector are coming together to work collaboratively on this monitoring. And so I think the models are changing, but for me, this community opened the door for the private sector to come in, which assets like Planet has, increase spatial, spectral, or temporal resolution. You need both. It's not an either or. We need those workhorses that were out there with whether Japanese, American, European satellites, but the private sector has got immense capability to come in and just target more analyses, and we need it for climate change.
Yeah, on the DoD and IC side, I think I want to, I really liked what you were talking about, Anthony. I want to pick up that thing that you put to the side, which is think about it as one of the world's largest companies and contributors to some of the challenges that we have. That frankly is something to really investigate from a deep systems level perspective. There's a tremendous amount of influence that the U.S. military has over us, over the community. But then you can think about it from an economic perspective over the market. The way in which they do their business, really a lot of it gets done with contractors and partners. And they could use the power of the pen to say, hey, I want to do it this way. And then that capability and capacity gets built up into the contractor base, into the industrial base. And many companies are getting to a point where you want to actually build a product or a service that can scale and replicate to others. So I think one major ingredient that the DoD and IC has is how they engage with industry and the contractor base, to be thinking about it as part of their responsibility to use the strong market forces that they have to set the behavior in the industrial base that we're looking for, because we have to retool how we do business as usual, and I think that's a large lever.
Yeah. Speaking of, really large organizations and people who have a responsibility because they add to climate change, a large topic that I've heard over especially the last couple years has been space sustainability. And so the GEOINT community, and especially those that are building and launching sensors, obviously also add to the climate crisis through pollution. How do we balance, what we are deciding to launch, the volumes that we're deciding to launch, all of those things? How are each of you thinking of that? Anthony, in terms of your portfolio, Robbie, obviously your company, and then Barb, the folks that are in your community as well. We can start with you if you'd like.
Jeez. So let me make sure I understand. Are you talking about?
Or we can jump to Robbie first if you'd
Sounds
like.
good.
I think I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, on when it comes to space sustainability,
Yeah.
it is contributing to debris in space.
Well, I was actually thinking
and RF.
also launch and creation of materials and things like that.
Yeah, actually, we've done a deep study on that, and it's not that much in the scheme of things. Launch doesn't contribute that much to the major things that we have, especially when you think about it net benefit around gaining greater context around what's happening. But it is true. There is a true cost there. But in the space community, space sustainability is really kind of around freedom of navigation, space security, RF spectrum, and debris. And I think on the latter part, debris, you can think about that as like plastic in the ocean, right? You don't really see it for a while until you see a lot of it. And it does have these unintended consequences. So that is a real challenge in the community, but the biggest issue that we're having is from the activities in space in the 60s and 70s. And now the larger issue, or now, like most responsible companies, are designing for demise, so that they make sure that they launch their upper stages, and then so they can bring it back down. They design it with materials that aren't so toxic to the upper atmosphere, and same for constellations of satellites. But this is a heavy, active debate at the moment, and space is effectively a global commons, and so then it's a much more challenging policy framework to work in, especially now that you have companies launching these mega constellations. But there are some good forums in place for it, but it's a completely unsolved problem. But it's an interesting microcosm for managing the high seas and managing the emissions and so forth, which is the challenge of our time in globally interconnected society. How do we manage our collective threats, and how do we actually manage our global commons?
Yeah. Anthony, thoughts?
Yeah, I think, Robbie, you basically addressed the primary issues on that question. And really the only add I would make is that the space economy is also a driver, a really significant driver in innovation that I think is helpful for the climate crisis. Obviously on the information and data collection piece, which I think the space economy has really changed the game on how we understand the Earth and Earth science and climate science because of all of the new data coming down. But also on things like vehicles and technology that have to operate in space, for example, have to do so in power-constrained instances and so forth. And that's driven, for example, certain technologies like solar panel technology and so forth, that is then can be ported over into Earth-based technology that's probably helping. So, I do think that the pressures of this highly competitive space economy are a net benefit when it comes to innovation that is going to help address climate change issues.
Awesome. We have a bunch of folks in the audience here who are obviously all from the geospatial community. What do you guys think, the untapped opportunities that you hope that either future entrepreneurs or organizations you've worked with are going to get into in the next 5 years? What do you think are those big opportunities that you guys are really excited about? And Anthony, we can start with you.
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
Yeah.
One of the things that, again, I'm a space guy, so that's the frame to which I look at some of these things. One is I love the in-space infrastructure for connectivity. And that opens up quite a bit of downstream products that give you real-time insights into what's happening. So I think that that's going to be amazing. And imagine being able to have models that task satellites, and you just have a dashboard of near real-time information around things that are happening. That back-end infrastructure, starting from space, different types of sensors, multimodal sensors, processing that all the way through, I think is really going to be quite profound for the community.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this concept of global scale, systematic, continuous data collection of the Earth at kind of Earth scale. And that's something that even 10 years ago was probably a kind of science fiction dream. I don't think anybody would have realistically talked about it. And now you have, I think we're headed in that direction. And companies like Robbie are doing so in EOIR. But that's not limited to that. You think about SAR, hyperspectral imagery, which I think will be a breakthrough technology for understanding what's going on on the Earth. And if you imagine global continuous hyperspectral imagery with a resolution that's helpful, imagine what you can do with that to understand what's going on in real time all over the Earth, where polluters are, where carbon is coming from, be able to tactically, frankly, go after those polluters. Oftentimes they're doing so illegally, or big picture, be able to create simulations of what's going on in the Earth and then make strategic changes to how we use resources and so forth in a really smart way. All of that was impossible and undreamable just a few years ago, and now I think is very realistic. And I think there are companies, in fact, in the audience that are thinking about how to do this on a daily basis and raising money to do it. And that is probably something I think we'll see in the next decade or so. And I think it's going to absolutely change the game when it comes to addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think there are two things from my perspective. We're just starting a study on spatial digital twins, and so I'm really excited about that. We're doing a global scan of legislation around the world on who's got any regulations or legislation in place that affect that. So I think it's going to help the industry a lot. A lot of our members are working in that area. And then maybe just building on this last point about a systems approach, another WGIC member called Voxel Maps has got an Earth-centered system where rather than looking just at our 2D pixels of data, in fact is looking at 3D voxels, actually 4D through time, from the center of the Earth to above the Earth. And if you could imagine just populating each one of those voxels, centimeter scale, possible to go down as far as centimeter scale with data, I think you could start to get to the point of a true systems model. So you need the data, but you need a capability to store, analyze, and then project. There have been wonderful exhibits this week about just the visualization that can be done with 3D data. So I think it's coming together. Optimistic about that. Not so optimistic about the state of the planet from a climate change perspective.
Yeah, the irony of an NGA person bringing up the sensor and then leaving off the ground in analytics, part for other people to think of. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the analytics, digital twins, modeling, simulation. We're going to need that to handle any sort of global collection capability when it comes to Earth science, and it doesn't really exist right now. But I know people are working on it.
Yeah, the Europeans are really interested in this right now with Joseph Aschbacher. I can't remember what they're calling it. I think it's called digital
I think
twin.
it is the Earth, yeah.
Awesome.
And what I would hope is that it doesn't become something that is just one company, and it becomes just part of their product, but something, it may be an open source approach, and maybe an open source model approach, and maybe a consortium approach, but having several different models running that aren't able to talk to each other and aren't able to be integrated is going to slow us down in our understanding. And we need to start thinking a little bit differently about how we do integrate these things. And organizations like yours, honestly, Barb, are kind of, I think, the places to do that.
And the Open Geospatial Consortium when
Exactly,
it comes to standards, when it comes to really making things interoperable. Because with the vast amount of data that we have, like our global compute is in a federated compute, right, at the edge. And data needs to be where it lies, but then you have to query against it, which is a small amount of data transfer, to then fuse it together in such a way. Then when that can happen, then this community grows tremendously, because you don't need to really understand exactly the phenomenology of the sensor or all the way to making sure that you have geoassurance. You can get to a higher order data product that then allows for developers and businesses to then build their own sense-making applications around their supply chain or the risks that they actually face. So like, I think standards will probably, it is a necessary, and I totally agree there should not be one organization or one country who's actually doing this. This is a shared crisis that we have. And it's also something that more of, liberal democratic nations and frames, they should really come together on. And because, we're in a struggle right now with the great power competition, and this is something that can bridge quite a bit of the Atlantic and other democratic states.
Yeah. Speaking of, everybody having to participate together in order to solve problems, we've been talking a lot about predicting and modeling and using this data to better understand what's happening. On the other side of, probably in a more immediate sense, the climate crisis and responding to major natural disasters, that sort of, the community comes together and often works together in ways during a crisis that they don't in their day-to-day business. However, you usually need a catalyst to help bring them together. Who do you guys see as the correct party to help organize people around weather disasters, especially when the GEOINT community has to come together rapidly in order to help understand the situation? We can start with you, Barb. Like, who should be the organizing person? We've seen everything from volunteer groups to governments to private companies. All sorts of models have happened over the last few years.
Well, honestly, I think it's a hard question.
It is,
because I don't think our system exists to actually have that happen, and nor should it. Because it does have to be, whether it's the role of standards setting organizations or your international collaboration, they're just going to be, I think it's important to have associations at the table that represent, groups of people, but I don't think you can look at one entity.
Yeah.
I spent 4 years with WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, which is the UN organization for atmospheric studies. And so there are UN structures in place, but my goodness, there's just so much bureaucracy associated with it that I think there's just got to be a different model out there to bring all the sectors together.
No, I agree that there isn't an obvious answer because, I remember like when what was it? It was the Haiti earthquake. I was working at NASA at the time and living in Silicon Valley, and so our friends at Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, and the World Bank all got together to then hack for humanity, we called it, or whatever, and it turned into an organization called Random Hacks of Kindness. So just a way for people all around the world to be able to then activate data, create really, really simple sense-making tools and support out, more like digital diplomacy kind of. And there was a neat participation architecture if you're a developer, right, in order to do that. And so that's like one ingredient, but like, I think in reality, when you do end up having a natural disaster, it's your local communities that are the first responders. And being able to like data enable them, right, by understanding context. So first of all, understanding that there's an emerging risk. But then be able to data enable them, which we can now have connectivity from space. And if we get toward a digital twin and really simple apps and tools, there can be really needed information at the time that can save lives. But I don't think it's the UN. and I don't think it's just nations. It also we should be thinking about the individual as well in the local communities.
Yeah, this is a really hard one, because the climate crisis is not something that will ever have a singular event. There won't be a Pearl Harbor or 9/11. I think our nation in particular responds very well to those types of events, and creates whole of government, if not whole of nation responses. And we won't have that. Maybe at a local level, but if you think of wildfires and so forth, but not at a national and certainly not at an international level. So it will, and therefore I also don't think there will be a singular convening body either. I mean, I do think the Defense Department will play a big role. Businesses will play a big role. The rise of ESG and the amount of money going into ESG funds really is changing the game for how money flows through the investment system, what companies get it, and so forth. And yes, there may be a lot of greenwashing and things like that, but nonetheless, there is an incentive structure in place for organizations and companies in particular to work that way. So I think, and obviously there's already the nonprofit community working on the issue. So there won't be a singular convener of these things. I think really what will happen, there will be multiple organizations in each sector addressing the issue kind of in parallel, and then hopefully we can serve to redefine the issue, like I was saying before, treat it as a national security issue and so forth, which can coalesce and converge their efforts into something that is a little more efficient. And that's really what we're talking about, is how do we make them efficient by working together hand in hand and not being completely separate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Some of the audience questions, and this will be our last question, since we're very rapidly running out of time. I don't know how many people here are familiar with like the idea of the whale song, right? Which was the first time that whales were recorded, it became this very moving thing for people to be like, we need to save the ocean. What do you think is the whale song that the GEOINT community can provide the world to help make climate change more tangible and help inspire action? We can start with you, Robbie, because I know you guys produce a lot of data.
I would think I think one of the things that really kind of brought a little bit of the overview effect to humanity was Google Earth, right? The ability for any individual person to kind of see their home and then see their community and their nation and the Earth. And so I think that we can do the next level of that, which is to then play with time. And be able to actually allow for people to forecast out what potential futures are. But even just going back in time, taking the Landsat archive, the time-lapse stuff that Google has done, it really is moving to see how much we're terraforming our planet. And I think that might be a signal that business as usual, or the way in which we behave is not going to last for very long, and that we have to change our behavior. What do you think, Barb?
Well, I think that's a great example, because when you go back to Google Earth, it was largely based on broad open access to the Landsat archive, and
Absolutely.
then pulling in
And by the way, that
Sentinel
was
data.
In-Q-Tel.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the role of the public and the private sector
Exactly.
in partnerships. So for sure, I think that is good. I don't know. I'm concerned about the future of the Earth, and I think, Anthony, you're the one that says let's not even talk about climate change. It's a climate crisis, and
Yep.
and yet it is more the frog in the water that versus just getting thrown into the boiling water. You're absolutely right. We're still not doing a good job of communicating the urgency of the issue.
Absolutely. Any last thoughts?
Well, look, there's an increasing amount of skepticism of science in American society for various reasons. And that makes the communication of scientific thinking and scientific proof, for that matter, harder and harder. And I think that GEOINT is unique as a means of communication of information and analysis in that it's very easy to understand it. And you get this sort of seeing is believing effect when you show someone a map with some data on it or a picture from a satellite. You cannot deny that realistically. It's very hard to do that. And so I think proliferating GEOINT from something that is primarily used right now by governments, a little bit by academia, a little bit by business, into something that's understood and used broadly by people. And like Robbie said, Google Maps really kind of was the first to do that. But you can imagine all sorts of other products that we could have in our lives that communicate information in that way, and it becomes the norm for the average watcher of the news to engage with GEOINT type information as opposed to a talking head just telling them something, or frankly, a lot of times miscommunicating a scientific paper to show them GEOINT type products to learn how we in the GEOINT community communicate information using those products, to show that to people. I think that will help. I think that will help to get over a lot of this skepticism, to educate people and allow them to engage even when they don't have the scientific background to engage in other ways. And that does give me some hope, and I think is a way that this community can really truly help the climate crisis issue.
Yeah, thank you all. We have run out of time, but we'll let these final thoughts that we just covered hopefully be an inspiration to everybody to go out there and do your best GEOINTing and create beautiful products that the world can understand and actually interpret and help move people to pay attention to the climate crisis. So thank you, everybody.
Great.
And thank you, guys.
Thank you.